Good day, my dear listener. How has your day been? I hope it was filled with love, warmth, and little moments of joy. But now it's time to let go of all your worries, all the stress of the day, and let your mind drift into a world of peaceful dreams. Here at Helen's Sleepy Bedtime Stories Love and Fantasy, I invite you to relax and unwind as I tell you a tale that will soothe your soul and help you sleep well. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen to the calming story of how my 65-years-old Nigbor made love with me better than my husband. It was a hot summer afternoon when I first noticed Mr. Thompson, my 65-year-old neighbor, looking at me in a way that made my heart race. He was out watering his garden, his wrinkled face hidden behind dark sunglasses, but I could feel his eyes on me. I was standing at the window of my kitchen, sipping coffee, wearing a loose robe that barely concealed my body. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip again, leaving me alone for the next few days. Mark and I had been married for 10 years, but the passion had long since faded. He was a good man, but our love life had become dull and routine. The fire that once burned between us had reduced to occasional flickers, leaving me longing for something more, something exciting. Mr. Thompson's gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and instead of feeling uncomfortable, I felt a strange thrill. Mr. Thompson had always been kind to me, offering help whenever I needed it. He would mow our lawn when Mark was away or carry heavy groceries into the house for me. He had a charm about him, the kind that older men carry with confidence, knowing they have lived and seen it all. But today, his charm felt different, more intense, more deliberate. As I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about him. He was a widower, his wife had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, he had been living alone. Despite his age, there was something undeniably attractive about him. His salt and pepper hair, his broad shoulders, and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence made me wonder what it would be like to be with someone like him. I shook the thought from my head, embarrassed at myself for even considering it. After all, I was a married woman, and Mr. Thompson was my elderly neighbor. But as the day went on, I found myself thinking about him more and more. Every time I glanced out the window, he was there, moving slowly through his garden, his shirt clinging to his chest from the sweat, his strong hands gripping the hose. Later that evening, I was sitting on the porch, trying to enjoy the warm breeze when I heard his familiar voice calling my name. "Sandra," he said with a smile, walking over from his yard. "I made some fresh lemonade. Thought you might like a glass." His voice was deep, and the way he said my name sent shivers down my spine. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," I replied, smiling. "That sounds lovely." I invited him to sit with me on the porch, and as we sipped lemonade together, I couldn't help but notice how close he sat next to me. Our legs were nearly touching, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His presence was comforting, yet thrilling at the same time. We talked for a while, about nothing in particular, just the weather, the neighborhood, and how fast time flies. But there was an underlying tension between us that I couldn't ignore. Every time he looked at me, I felt a stirring deep inside, something I hadn't felt in years with my husband. It was as if he could see through me, as if he knew exactly what I was craving. As the conversation continued, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a soft murmur. "You look lonely, Sandra," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Is everything all right?" His words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. How could he know? How could he sense the emptiness that had been growing inside me for so long? I'm fine," I stammered, trying to hide the tremble in my voice. But he didn't believe me. He placed his hand on mine, his touch firm yet gentle. My heart raced, and I didn't pull away. There was something about the way he touched me that felt different, something that made my pulse quicken and my breath catch in my throat. "You don't have to pretend," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "I see the way you look at me, Sandra. I know you're not happy." His words were like a spark, igniting something deep within me. I felt my body reacting to him in ways I hadn't expected, and I couldn't stop myself from leaning in closer, our faces now just inches apart. Before I could say anything, he kissed me. His lips were surprisingly soft, yet demanding, and I melted into his embrace. It was as if years of pent-up desire had finally found an outlet, and I couldn't resist him. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, and all the guilt I had felt moments before melted away. My robe slipped open slightly, revealing more of my skin, and I felt his hands exploring my body, tracing the curve of my waist and hips. His touch was electrifying, and I found myself craving more. He was nothing like my husband. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in his movements. He knew exactly what he was doing, and it drove me wild. We stumbled inside, our bodies tangled together as we kissed passionately. I had never been so hungry for someone in my life. He pushed me against the wall, his lips trailing down my neck, sending shivers through my body. I moaned softly, not caring if anyone heard us. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, alive, desired, and utterly consumed. As we made our way to the bedroom, I couldn't help but marvel at how confident he was, how he seemed to know exactly what I needed without me saying a word. He undressed me slowly, savoring every inch of my skin as if he was discovering it for the first time. His touch was gentle yet firm, and every caress sent waves of pleasure coursing through me. When we finally came together, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. He was slow, deliberate, and every movement felt like it was designed to drive me wild. I had never felt so completely in tune with someone, as if he could read my body and know exactly how to pleasure me. My moans filled the room as he brought me to heights of ecstasy I had never known. We spent the night together, exploring each other's bodies, losing ourselves in the passion that had overtaken us. I couldn't believe how much pleasure he was able to give me, how he made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. It was as if he had unlocked a part of me that I didn't even know existed. When the sun began to rise, we lay there in silence, our bodies entwined, basking in the afterglow of what had just happened. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a fulfillment that I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Mr. Thompson had awakened something inside me that my husband had long since forgotten. As I lay there next to him, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this be a one-time thing? Or had we crossed a line that we could never go back from? Part of me felt guilty, but another part of me didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt desired, wanted, and completely satisfied. The guilt began to creep in as the reality of what I had done started to settle. I was a married woman, yet I had just spent the night with my 65-year-old neighbor. But the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming pleasure that still coursed through my body. I had never been touched like that before, not even by Mark. I felt conflicted, torn between my loyalty to my husband and the undeniable attraction I felt for Mr. Thompson. I got out of bed, careful not to wake him, and slipped into the bathroom. My reflection in the mirror looked different, flushed, glowing, and alive. My body still buzzed with the sensations from the night before, and despite everything, I smiled. There was no denying that I had enjoyed every second of it. I felt like a woman again, like I was more than just a wife or someone's partner. I had rediscovered myself in the arms of another man. As I dressed quietly, my mind raced with thoughts of how this would affect my marriage. Mark had been distant for years, more focused on his career than our relationship. I had tried to fix things, to bring back the passion we once had, but nothing seemed to work. And now, after what had happened, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try anymore. Mr. Thompson stirred in the bed, his eyes slowly opening as he noticed me getting dressed. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice deep and raspy from sleep. There was a warmth in his tone that made me feel safe, like I didn't need to apologize or explain myself to him. He understood me in ways Mark never could. "I have to," I replied softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Mark will be back tomorrow, and I need to get the house ready." The words felt hollow as they left my lips. Preparing for my husband's return seemed almost meaningless after the night I had just experienced. Mr. Thompson reached out and touched my hand, his fingers gently stroking my palm. "You don't have to go," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine. "You deserve to be happy, Sandra. You deserve to feel loved." His words hit me hard, and for a moment, I considered staying. The way he made me feel, desired, cherished, seen, it was something I hadn't felt in years. But I knew I couldn't stay. I needed time to think, to process everything. I left his house that morning with a heavy heart, but also with a strange sense of fulfillment. I had crossed a line, one that I could never uncross, but it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something I had needed for a long time. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Thompson had said. I did deserve to be happy. I deserved to feel loved. The next few days were a blur. Mark returned home, and everything went back to normal, at least on the surface. But I wasn't the same. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Thompson and the way he had made me feel. I found myself daydreaming about him, replaying the night we spent together over and over in my mind. It was as if he had awakened something inside me that I couldn't ignore. Mark didn't seem to notice the change in me. He was too busy with work, too preoccupied with his business calls and emails to realize that I had drifted away from him. Our conversations were short, and our physical connection was practically non-existent. Every night, I lay in bed next to him, longing for the passion and excitement I had felt with Mr. Thompson. One evening, as Mark was away on another business trip, I found myself standing at the window again, watching Mr. Thompson in his garden. My heart raced as our eyes met, and I felt that same spark of desire that I had felt the first time. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I wanted him. I needed him. Before I knew it, I was walking over to his house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew that I couldn't stay away from him any longer. When he opened the door, his eyes lit up with surprise, but also with the same desire that I felt burning inside me. Without a word, he pulled me inside and kissed me, just like he had that first night. His hands roamed my body, and I melted into his embrace, my body craving his touch. The guilt I had felt before was gone, replaced by a hunger that I couldn't ignore. I needed him, and he needed me. We spent the entire night together, exploring each other's bodies with the same intensity and passion as before. He made love to me slowly, savoring every moment, every touch. It was like nothing I had ever experienced with Mark. Mr. Thompson knew how to make me feel alive, how to make me feel like a woman again. As the night wore on, I realized that I couldn't go back to the way things were. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine with Mark when I had experienced what real passion and connection felt like. Mr. Thompson had shown me what it was like to be truly desired, to be truly loved, and I couldn't let that go. But what could I do? I was married, and leaving Mark would be complicated. Our lives were so intertwined, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to give that up. But every time I thought about staying with Mark, I felt a deep sense of sadness, knowing that I would never feel the way I felt with Mr. Thompson. The next morning, as I lay in Mr. Thompson's arms, I made a decision. I wasn't going to live a life of quiet desperation anymore. I wasn't going to settle for a loveless marriage when I knew what real love and passion felt like. It was time to make a change for myself, for my happiness. Leaving Mark wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I had spent too many years putting his needs before my own, and it was time to start thinking about what I wanted. I deserved to be happy, and I deserved to be with someone who made me feel alive. As I packed my bags, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the expectations of being the perfect wife, free from the guilt of not being able to make my marriage work. I was choosing myself, and it felt empowering. I left a note for Mark, explaining that I needed time to figure things out. I didn't tell him about Mr. Thompson. I didn't think he would understand. But I did tell him that I couldn't continue living the way we had been living, that I needed more from our relationship than what he was able to give. When I walked over to Mr. Thompson's house, my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I wanted to be with him. He was waiting for me at the door, his eyes filled with concern as he saw the suitcase in my hand. "I'm leaving Mark," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion. "I can't do it anymore. I want to be with you." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise, but then a slow smile spread across his face. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "You don't have to rush into anything, Sandra," he said gently. "But if this is what you want, I'm here for you." His words were comforting, and I knew that I had made the right decision. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. The days following my decision were a whirlwind of emotions. I moved into a small apartment temporarily, needing space to clear my head. Mr. Thompson was supportive, giving me the time and distance I needed. He would come over in the evenings, bringing dinner and a comforting presence. We talked about everything, life, love, and the complicated decisions we had made. He listened without judgment, which made me feel even more drawn to him. Mark's response to my letter was surprisingly calm. He called, asking for an explanation, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He wasn't angry, he wasn't heartbroken, he was just resigned, as though he had expected this. Our conversation was short, filled with awkward silences and polite pleasantries. In some ways, that made it easier to walk away, knowing that the love we once had was already gone. As time passed, I realized that my life with Mark had been defined by routine. We had fallen into the comfort of familiarity, and somewhere along the way, we had stopped trying. I wondered if Mark even remembered the last time he had held me the way Mr. Thompson did. I wondered if he even noticed the distance that had grown between us over the years. One evening, after spending another blissful day with Mr. Thompson, I found myself thinking about the future. What would happen next? Was I ready to fully commit to this new chapter in my life? The idea of a future with Mr. Thompson excited me, but it also scared me. After all, he was much older than I was, and I couldn't help but wonder how that would affect us in the long run. Mr. Thompson seemed to sense my hesitation. One night, as we lay together in bed, he turned to me and asked, "Are you happy, Sandra?" His question caught me off guard, but I appreciated his honesty. He always knew when something was on my mind, and he never shied away from difficult conversations. "I am," I replied, my voice soft. "But sometimes I wonder, what if this doesn't work out? What if we're too different?" My insecurities bubbled to the surface, and I felt a pang of fear. I had already given up so much to be with him, and the thought of losing him terrified me. Mr. Thompson smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Sandra, life is full of uncertainties. But one thing I do know is that you make me happy, and I want to spend as much time as I can with you. We can't predict the future, but we can enjoy the present." His words comforted me, and I realized that I had been overthinking things. I was finally with someone who made me feel alive, who saw me for who I really was. That was enough for now. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to let myself be happy. The months flew by, and my relationship with Mr. Thompson deepened. We spent our days exploring the city, going on long walks, and sharing stories about our lives. He had lived such a full life, filled with experiences and wisdom that I found fascinating. In many ways, he had become more than just a lover. He was my best friend, my confidant. But as happy as I was with him, I couldn't ignore the whispers from people around us. Friends and acquaintances who knew about my separation from Mark started to ask questions. Some were supportive, while others were judgmental, especially when they learned about Mr. Thompson's age. "Isn't he a little old for you?" they would ask, their eyes filled with skepticism. At first, the comments bothered me. I had always cared about what others thought of me, and the idea that people were judging my relationship made me uncomfortable. But over time, I learned to block out the noise. I knew what I felt for Mr. Thompson, and I knew that our connection was real. What other people thought didn't matter anymore. One afternoon, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Mr. Thompson took my hand in his. "Sandra, there's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice soft but steady. My heart skipped a beat, sensing the seriousness in his tone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "I know this is sudden, but I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, my heart overflowing with emotion. I hadn't expected this, but in that moment, everything felt right. I realized that I wanted the same thing. I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, no matter what anyone else thought. "Yes," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and we embraced, both of us overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. The next few weeks were a blur of wedding preparations and excitement. We decided to keep the ceremony small and intimate, inviting only a few close friends and family members. I didn't want a big, extravagant wedding. I just wanted to celebrate our love with the people who mattered most. The day of the wedding arrived, and as I stood in front of the mirror in my simple white dress, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had made the right decision. I was marrying a man who loved me for who I was, who made me feel alive in ways I had never thought possible. As I walked down the aisle, my eyes locked onto Mr. Thompson, who stood waiting for me with a smile on his face. He looked so handsome, so full of life, and I knew in that moment that I had found my soulmate. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with love and laughter. As we exchanged our vows, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the journey that had led me to this moment. My life had taken unexpected twists and turns, but they had all brought me to him. That night, as we danced under the stars, I felt a sense of contentment that I had never known before. I was exactly where I was meant to be, with the person I was meant to be with. I had chosen happiness, and it had chosen me. As we settled into our new life together, I found myself reflecting on the past year. I had grown so much, both as a person and as a partner. I had learned to put myself first, to prioritize my happiness, and to let go of the things that no longer served me. Mr. Thompson and I built a life together, filled with love, laughter, and endless adventure. We traveled, explored new hobbies, and spent countless hours just talking, sharing our dreams and fears. He continued to surprise me every day, showing me that love wasn't about age or appearances, it was about connection, understanding, and mutual respect. As we spent more time together, the deep connection between Mr. Thompson and me only grew stronger. He was attentive and thoughtful, always making me feel cherished. Every day, he would bring a new joy into my life, whether it was surprising me with breakfast in bed or planning a spontaneous weekend getaway to a nearby town. It was a life I had never imagined I would have, especially with someone like him. The more we bonded, the more I realized that age didn't matter in love. The way he treated me, with kindness and respect, was something I hadn't experienced in years. Our conversations were rich with wisdom, and his stories about life kept me enthralled. He wasn't just my partner, he was my teacher, my friend, and my confidant. Though the age difference occasionally drew stares from strangers, I didn't care. I found myself growing stronger and more confident in my choices. I had walked away from a loveless marriage and found true love in the most unexpected place. Every day, I was reminded of how lucky I was to have met Mr. Thompson, and nothing else mattered. One evening, we decided to have a small gathering at our home to celebrate our first few months of marriage. Close friends, neighbors, and family members gathered in our backyard, under the soft glow of string lights. It was a night filled with laughter, good food, and the warmth of loved ones. As the evening came to a close, I looked around at the happy faces and realized how much my life had changed for the better. There was one moment during the party that stood out. Mark showed up. I hadn't expected him to come, but he greeted me with a smile and congratulated me. We exchanged pleasantries, and for the first time, there was no bitterness or sadness between us. It was a moment of closure that I hadn't known I needed. Mark had moved on, and so had I. As the night drew to a close, I found myself dancing with Mr. Thompson, his arms wrapped around me as we swayed to the soft music. I leaned my head against his chest, feeling the warmth of his embrace. It was moments like this that made me realize I had found my forever home in his arms. With every day that passed, we grew closer. Our love felt timeless, like it transcended all the usual boundaries. Mr. Thompson wasn't just my husband, he was my best friend, my soulmate, and the man who had taught me to truly live again. Together, we created a life filled with passion, laughter, and endless memories. One weekend, we decided to take a trip to a quiet, secluded cabin in the mountains. It was a getaway we both needed, a break from the world, where we could focus solely on each other. The serene beauty of the landscape mirrored the peacefulness we felt in our relationship. The first night, we sat by the fireplace, sipping wine and talking late into the night, sharing stories and dreams for the future. As the fire crackled and cast a warm glow across the room, Mr. Thompson reached out, taking my hand in his. "Sandra, do you ever regret leaving your old life behind?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. It was a question I had asked myself many times in the early days, but now, the answer was clear. I smiled, shaking my head. "Not for a second. You've given me a life I never thought I could have, a life full of love, joy, and true happiness. I don't regret a thing." My words seemed to reassure him, and we sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. As the night wore on, our connection deepened even further. We made love with the same intensity and passion we had shared on that very first night. The way he touched me, the way he knew every inch of my body, made me feel completely desired and cherished. He always took his time, ensuring that every moment was as pleasurable for me as it was for him. Our intimacy was not just physical, it was emotional too. With every kiss and every touch, I felt the depth of our bond growing stronger. It wasn't just about the act of making love, it was about the love itself, the connection we shared that went beyond the physical. In the quiet aftermath, as we lay wrapped in each other's arms, I realized how much I had changed since I had first met Mr. Thompson. I had grown into a stronger, more confident version of myself, someone who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. I had found my voice, and I had found my happiness. We spent the next few days at the cabin, completely immersed in each other. We hiked through the mountains, explored the nearby lakes, and spent our evenings by the fire, talking and laughing until the early hours of the morning. It was the perfect escape, a reminder of why we had fallen in love in the first place. When we returned home, we both felt a renewed sense of energy and excitement for the future. We talked about the possibility of traveling more, of exploring new places and creating more memories together. There was so much of the world left to see, and I couldn't wait to experience it all with him. The months flew by, and before I knew it, a year had passed since our wedding day. To celebrate, we decided to return to the spot where we had first made love, the garden where everything had started. It was a quiet, intimate celebration, just the two of us, surrounded by the memories of that fateful night. As we stood together, hand in hand, I realized how much had changed in that year. I had gone from feeling trapped in a loveless marriage to finding a love that made me feel more alive than ever before. I had found a partner who loved me unconditionally, who made me feel like the most important person in the world. Mr. Thompson and I had built a life together that was filled with love, passion, and adventure. We had faced challenges along the way, but we had come out stronger because of them. Our love was the kind that people dreamed about, the kind that defied expectations and stood the test of time. As we celebrated our first anniversary, I couldn't help but feel excited for the future. There were so many more adventures to be had, so many more memories to be made. And I knew that no matter what life threw at us, we would face it together, hand in hand, just as we had from the very beginning. Looking back on everything, I realized that my life had taken an unexpected turn, but it was the best decision I had ever made. I had followed my heart, and it had led me to the kind of love I had always dreamed of, the kind that made me feel alive, cherished, and truly happy. As I stood there in the garden with Mr. Thompson, I knew that this was only the beginning. We had a lifetime of love and happiness ahead of us, and I couldn't wait to see where the journey would take us next. As we stood in the garden, a gentle breeze blew through the trees, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the peacefulness of the moment wash over me. Mr. Thompson's hand was warm in mine, and as I opened my eyes, I saw the same love and admiration in his gaze that had been there since that very first night. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" I said softly, smiling up at him. He chuckled and nodded, his eyes twinkling with affection. "We certainly have, Sandra. And I wouldn't change a single thing." His words made my heart swell with joy, and I squeezed his hand in response. That night, we decided to relive the magic of our first encounter, though this time, there was no hesitancy or uncertainty. We were two people deeply in love, who knew every inch of each other's souls and bodies. The connection between us was undeniable, and the passion that burned in our hearts had only grown stronger over time. Under the stars, we made love in the garden once more, just as we had on that fateful night. The intimacy between us was overwhelming, and each touch, each kiss, felt like a celebration of the life we had built together. Every sensation was heightened, as if our bodies and hearts were perfectly attuned to one another. As we lay on the soft grass, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. I had found my place in the world, and it was right here in this garden, with Mr. Thompson by my side. The love we shared was more than just physical, it was a deep emotional bond that had grown stronger with every passing day. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was in moments like these that I knew I had made the right choice. Life had taken me down a path I hadn't expected, but it had led me to a love that fulfilled me in ways I had never thought possible. In the quiet of the night, I found myself thinking about the future. There was so much more I wanted to experience with Mr. Thompson, so many dreams yet to be realized. We had built a life together, but there was still so much left to explore, so much love left to share. As the weeks turned into months, our bond only deepened. We spent our days exploring new places, trying new things, and savoring every moment together. Whether it was a simple walk through the park or a grand adventure in a foreign country, every experience was made richer by the love we shared. Good day, my dear listener. How has your day been? I hope it was filled with love, warmth, and little moments of joy. But now it's time to let go of all your worries, all the stress of the day, and let your mind drift into a world of peaceful dreams. Here at Helen's Sleepy Bedtime Stories Love and Fantasy, I invite you to relax and unwind as I tell you a tale that will soothe your soul and help you sleep well. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen to the calming story of how my 65 years old Nigbor made love with me better than my husband. It was a hot summer afternoon when I first noticed Mr. Thompson, my 65-year-old neighbor, looking at me in a way that made my heart race. He was out watering his garden, his wrinkled face hidden behind dark sunglasses, but I could feel his eyes on me. I was standing at the window of my kitchen, sipping coffee, wearing a loose robe that barely concealed my body. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip again, leaving me alone for the next few days. Mark and I had been married for 10 years, but the passion had long since faded. He was a good man, but our love life had become dull and routine. The fire that once burned between us had reduced to occasional flickers, leaving me longing for something more, something exciting. Mr. Thompson's gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and instead of feeling uncomfortable, I felt a strange thrill. Mr. Thompson had always been kind to me, offering help whenever I needed it. He would mow our lawn when Mark was away, or carry heavy groceries into the house for me. He had a charm about him, the kind that older men carry with confidence, knowing they have lived and seen it all. But today, his charm felt different, more intense, more deliberate. As I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about him. He was a widower, his wife had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, he had been living alone. Despite his age, there was something undeniably attractive about him. His salt and pepper hair, his broad shoulders, and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence made me wonder what it would be like to be with someone like him. I shook the thought from my head, embarrassed at myself for even considering it. After all, I was a married woman, and Mr. And I couldn't wait to see where it would take us next.